Every country has some sort of censorship protocol surrounding cinema. Horror is usually the genre that suffers from prohibition most often for obvious reasons. As a result, some of the most famous horror movies of all time have been deemed improper, denying certain film fans the chance to revel in their glory. This list includes movies that were told no by at least one country. Some of them are now available there, but only after many years of waiting or a little trip to the editing suite. And make sure you let us know in the comments your favorite previously banned, or perhaps still banned, horror movie. So let's dive in. I'm Adam, this is What Culture, and here are horror movies that got banned from certain countries. Thriller, A Cruel Picture, Sweden. This Swedish film from 1973 certainly doesn't hide the fact that it gets nasty. It's right there in the title. Thriller, A Cruel Picture was directed by Bo-Arne Verbenius and stars Christina Lindberg as a young girl named Madeline, who is forced into prostitution by an older man. As you can imagine, things only get worse for Madeline, as she is forced into a world of sleazy clients, drugs, and violence. Her pimp, Tony, even cuts out her eye. So far, so grim. Madeline then decides enough is enough and decides to exact revenge on those who have wronged her. This isn't particularly pleasant either, as it leads to a whole bunch of shooting and one guy getting strangled by a horse. At least that's pretty inventive. Despite getting an American release, albeit under a different name and with heavy edits, Thriller, A Cruel Picture was initially banned in its own home country. The Swedish censorship board finally relented and released the movie, but only after its runtime was cut down from 107 minutes to 82. Films about sexual abuse have obviously always struggled to clear their censors, even as far back as the mid-1970s. Salo, or 128 Days of Sodom, Australia. 1974's Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, is set in fascist Italy in the Second World War. A group of rich and deprived men hatch a plan to kidnap local teenagers and force them to commit vile acts of sexual deviance over the course of 4 months. Salo is meant to be a comment on the corruptive nature of power and wealth, but some countries certainly didn't see it that way. It took until the year 2000 for it to be theatrically released in the UK, and Australia banned it in 1976 on the grounds of indecency. The film is not for everyone, as the graphic depictions of the abuse suffered by the young people is far more gratuitous than modern audiences are used to. Still, there's no denying that this is certainly a thought-provoking piece of cinema. World War Z, China. Considering what we've seen so far on this list, 2013's horror action movie World War Z, or World War Z to our American audience, seems positively tame. Starring Brad Pitt as the world's sexiest United Nations employee, World War Z imagines what would happen if the planet was overrun by a swarm of fast-moving, intelligent zombies. Spoilers, it doesn't end well. The movie grossed $540 million worldwide, making it the most successful zombie movie of all time by that metric. One place where it took zero money was China, who were not happy with its content. When it comes to nation-states messing around with movies, China is one of the most famous offenders. What didn't it like about World War Z? The violence? The gore? Brad Pitt's hair? Well, we're not entirely sure. There was much confusion surrounding why the country's censors failed to authorize the movie. One line in the film was reportedly changed as it speculated that the zombie virus could have originated in China. Yes, that is creepy when you consider almost exactly the same thing would happen with COVID-19 nearly a decade later. Does this mean that Brad Pitt knew what was coming and didn't warn anyone? Probably not. Land of the Dead, Ukraine. 20 years after George A. Romero made his third Of the Dead movie, the legendary madman was back with film number 4. Land of the Dead starred Simon Baker, Dennis Hopper, and John Leguizamo, among others, and was set in a world where survivors of a zombie outbreak took shelter in a mini-society in Pittsburgh. You can make your own jokes about how living in Pittsburgh is worse than an apocalypse. Across Europe, the film mostly got given an 18 rating by the various classification boards. The UK actually gave it a 15 to start off with. One country was not happy with Romero's work though, and banned the movie from being screened. Ukraine's culture ministry claimed that depictions of cannibalism in the movie were insensitive. Memories of the Holodomor, a vast famine that resulted in several documented cases of humans eating each other, were still fresh in our society, according to one spokesperson for the ministry. As a result, Land of the Dead never saw the light of day in the country. Ukrainians would have to look to other means in order to get their zombie fix. Saw 6, Thailand. Honestly, it's a miracle the Saw franchise got 6 films in without somebody somewhere trying to ban it. The series' whole MO is to present increasingly more grim scenarios and to show people dying in more and more horrible ways. Yet it wasn't until 2009 that a line was finally drawn. Saw 6 once again takes a bunch of people and puts them into the world's worst reviewed escape room. Only this time Detective Mark Hoffman is at the controls. The film received high age ratings around the world, including in Spain, where it was labelled Película X. This meant that it could only be shown in selected adult theatres. Thailand went even further and said no to the movie altogether. It almost secured a theatrical release before Thai authorities doubled down on the ban on the grounds that the film posed a danger to public safety. Did they think Saw 6 would encourage people to build their own traps? If so, then why not ban all of the other Saw films too? Censorship is a confusing beast. The Exorcist Tunisia. There are many stories you could tell about the release of The Exorcist. William Friedkin's possession-based masterpiece opened to American audiences in 1973 and changed horror cinema forever. There were reports of people fleeing theaters or throwing up out of sheer terror, and the movie quickly gained a reputation as one of the scariest motion pictures ever made, a reputation it still carries to this very day. Naturally, with this much controversy surrounding it, it was only a matter of time before The Exorcist got clamped down on. Some areas of Wales banned the film from being shown, and in 1988, all home video copies of The Exorcist were removed from British stores. In Tunisia, it was prohibited right from the get-go under claims that it presented unjustified propaganda in favour of Christianity. This is utterly hilarious when you think about how many Christian groups denounced The Exorcist as the work of the devil. If you think about it, the Tunisian argument makes a lot of sense. The Exorcist does show the existence of demons and that Catholic rituals are effective against them. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, United Kingdom. The British Board of Film Classification has a bit of a reputation for coming down hard on edgy films. As this list has already shown, the BBFC has tinkered with several famous horror movies and once barred one of the most important ones ever made from being shown under its watch. Now, to give the BBFC some credit, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. It pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in 1974 through its frank depictions of violence and human depravity. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is still cited today as one of the most influential horror films ever made, so naturally there was a massive backlash against it when it was released. The UK somehow allowed it to be screened for a year before realising that they weren't comfortable with it anymore. It wouldn't be until 1999 that the BBFC would finally set it free, albeit with a hefty 18 rating attached. Whilst there were many other countries that pulled the plug on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the British examples show just how far certain countries have come with regards to horror in a relatively short period of time. The Evil Dead, Finland, Singapore, Ukraine. Who'd have thought that the man who directed one of the bloodiest, most visceral horror movies of the 1980s would end up helming a trilogy of beloved Spider-Man movies? Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead from 1981 turned many heads towards his work, and not always in a good way. The story of Ash and friends versus the Deadites is still regarded as a horror classic, but many at the time took one look at it and went, nope. The highly bloody nature of the movie, as well as its various sex scenes, was too much for the countries of Finland, Singapore, and Ukraine. They banned the movie on those grounds and treated the 2013 reboot in the same way. Even in the countries it was shown, The Evil Dead was tightly controlled. It received an X rating in both the UK and the US, the latter of whom have been surprisingly lax across this entire list. Does it matter that the movie is outlawed in certain places? Well, considering that a brand new iteration of the series recently debuted to high praise, the answer is probably no. I Spit on Your Grave, Various. In 1978, one of the most infamous horror series of all time made its debut. I Spit on Your Grave follows a woman named Jennifer as she takes her bloody revenge on the men who sexually assaulted her. That one sentence alone contains several reasons as to why this film got banned all over the world. Ireland, Norway, Iceland, and West Germany outlawed the movie due to its violence and the way it depicted its female lead. Ireland even went as far as to ban the film from being sold on DVD. In Canada, the film was initially banned before it was decided that individual provinces should have the final say. And of course, the BBFC were not happy with this movie's gory ways and refused to grant it a certificate. Some of the scenes in I Spit on Your Grave are pretty nasty, so it's not hard to see why it's been forbidden in so many different places. However, all these bans have done is to add to the movie's legend. As soon as something becomes unobtainable, people want it even more, even if that something does contain certain parts of the lower body being forcibly removed.
The Last House on the Left, Australia, United Kingdom, and United States. Wes Craven has caused a stir time and time again with features like Scream, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and The Hills Have Eyes. However, nothing caused as much outrage as the horror maestro's directorial debut. The Last House on the Left depicted sexual brutality on a level rarely seen in cinema at the time. According to Craven, the story is a commentary on how violence in media is glorified when it should be condemned. Sadly, a lot of people missed the point, assuming Craven's work was promoting anarchy. Due to Australia's harsh policies, the movie wasn't available in the land down under until 2004. Even though The Last House on the Left was heavily edited for the US, there were reports of audiences vomiting during screenings, storming out and threatening to destroy the footage. The Last House on the Left was released in the UK, but only after explicit scenes were removed. The censorship board redacted this decision several years later, banning it entirely. Film critic and horror virtuoso Mark Kermode repeatedly presented the movie to the British censors, hoping that they would overturn the decision. After being worn down for nearly 2 decades with multiple appeals, The Last House on the Left was finally released in the UK in 2008. Possession, United Kingdom. Possession revolves around a spy, Mark, whose life falls into disarray after his wife Anna suddenly leaves him. Desperate to uncover the truth, Mark discovers his wife's recent actions stem from something far more disturbing than he could have ever imagined. Even though Possession contains scenes of refrigerated body parts and fornicating monsters, it's the moment when Anna suffers an agonizing miscarriage that's sure to rattle anyone. Believing this sort of material wouldn't fly with an American audience, a recut version was released in the US. However, the truncated version was still considered too extreme for the United Kingdom. During this period, the British Board of Film Classification enforced restrictions on movies that were deemed inartistically vulgar, violent, or gory. Any feature that found itself in this bracket was referred to as a video nasty. Of the 72 films that fell victim to the BBFC's wrath, Possession is among the most infamous. Although the psychological drama had a brief run in British cinemas, its home release was banned until 2000. Despite being initially met with scorn and revulsion, time has been kind to Possession. Nowadays, it's considered the director's finest work and arguably the best movie to be labelled as a video nasty. Hostel Part 2, Germany. Due to its explicit content, Eli Roth's Hostel popularised the term torture porn months before it hit theatres. Since this wince-inducing horror contains scenes of snipped eyeballs, blowtorched faces, and drilled kneecaps, it's easy to see why. Little did horror fans know that Roth was saving the real nasty stuff for the sequel. Although Hostel Part 2 has a slew of revolting imagery, there's a particular scene that had everyone up in arms. Around the halfway point, the sadomasochistic Mrs. Bathory kidnaps one of the characters, Lorna, dragging her to a secluded room. When Lorna awakens, she finds herself gagged and naked while hanging upside down. Using a scythe, Mrs. Bathory slices off chunks of Lorna's back, stomach, and neck while showering in her blood. In most countries, this scene, among others, was heavily censored before the film was distributed. However, Germany took things to the extreme. The censorship board there found this scene to be so disturbing, it was cut entirely, including on the so-called extended version. Eventually, a Munich court decided this restriction wasn't good enough and had all versions of Hostel Part 2 banned. Mikey, United Kingdom. There are plenty of horror flicks that deal with the concept of a killer kid. The Omen, The Good Son, The Village of the Damned, and then there's Mikey. That creepy thriller centres around an orphaned boy who's taken in by a foster family. Over time, his new mother and father discover Mikey slaughtered his original family and intends to do the same to them. It's understandable why Mikey should have provoked a controversy, since it depicts a 9-year-old burning his victims alive, drowning them, stabbing them with glass shards, and electrocuting them in the bathtub. And yet, Mikey secured a worldwide release without causing much of a fuss. However, there was one country that took umbrage with the film's subject matter: the United Kingdom. If Mikey was released earlier, there would have been no issue. However, Mikey was submitted to the British censorship board the same year 2 minors in Liverpool carried out a murder. Believing the concept was too close to home, the censorship board consulted child psychologists and police officers to discuss the matter. After much deliberation, it was decided not to distribute Mikey in the UK. The Devils, Finland. There are some films that were once considered controversial but are deemed pretty tame by modern viewers. Psycho caused a hullabaloo in 1960 because it was the first feature to depict a toilet flushing. Nowadays, such a display isn't a big deal. However, The Devils is so controversial by today's standards, it's hard to believe the film made it into theatres in 1971. Ken Russell's historic drama was always going to cause a scene, since it blends 3 touchy subjects together: torture, sex, and religion. Considering The Devils contain scenes of a priest's knees being pulverized, a woman having sex with a bone, and naked nuns defiling a religious statue, the director should have known that his work would be torn apart, not just by critics, but by censors. Due to the subject matter, The Devils couldn't be released until it was heavily edited. However, government officials in Finland believed the movie's heinous content could affect the mental health of viewers, encouraging the censorship board to ban it outright. Despite several attempts to reverse this decision, The Devils was forbidden from being distributed in Finland until 2001. Mother's Day, Australia, United Kingdom, and Germany. Mother's Day kicks off with an elderly woman and her 2 deformed children garrotting and decapitating a young couple. As brutal as that prologue is, it's only a taste of what's to come. Since the film deals with inbreeding, torture, rape, castration, and smothering a person with inflatable breasts, yep, really, it would have been pretty baffling if this grisly slasher didn't get censored. Mother's Day caused uproar with British censors. I mean, are we really surprised? Leading to it being removed from distribution. Despite being repeatedly aired on British television, Mother's Day wasn't released on home media in the United Kingdom until 2015. Even though Australia is incredibly strict with how violence is depicted in media, Mother's Day was released there uncut in 1983. 2 years later, the Aussie censors had a change of heart, or maybe came to their senses, and had the film banned. Even though these measures are harsh, Mother's Day suffered the most scrutiny from Germany. Not only was it refused classification, the authorities confiscated all film reels to make sure it was virtually impossible for anyone to get their hands on a copy. Maniac, New Zealand. Maniac revolves around serial killer Frank Zito, who scalps women and uses their hair to craft wigs for his mannequins. Due to the brutal content, Maniac had serious trouble finding distribution. In fact, Maniac has only been legally distributed in the United Kingdom since 2022. Since the 2012 remake maintained the same gruesome premise as its predecessor, the movie caused another public outcry, this time in New Zealand. However, it wasn't Maniac's content that irked New Zealand, but its presentation. Unlike the original, the 2012 version depicts the entire story from the point of view of Frank, giving the impression the viewers are performing his heinous actions. The Australian Classification Board, which governs film distribution in New Zealand as well, was concerned by this style, believing its first-person portrayal and packaging as entertainment is likely to lead to erosion of empathy for some viewers. For this reason, the censorship board believed it was in their citizens' best interests to have Maniac banned theatrically and on DVD. Although Maniac can be screened in festivals and for academic purposes, its distribution is strictly forbidden. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, Hong Kong. If a movie could be banned solely because it was terrible, Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey would never see the light of day. Even though the idea of the honey-loving bear going on a killing spree is amusing, the underwhelming slasher does nothing with its bonkers premise. But since a movie can't be banned on the grounds that it's awful, Blood and Honey received a worldwide release. However, the film wasn't allowed to be shown in Hong Kong. Strangely, it wasn't the horror element that was the issue, it was Winnie the Pooh. After the character was used in a meme to mock Chinese leaders, Winnie and his whimsical friends received heavy censorship in the country. Although toys and books of Winnie, Tigger, Piglet and Eeyore are still available in Hong Kong, movies centered around the ensemble are forbidden. As such, Blood and Honey was banned, and it's a safe bet the sequel will suffer the same fate. I don't really think they're missing out. Frankenstein, Ireland. Despite Frankenstein's legacy, this adaptation of Mary Shelley's sci-fi novel has always been marred with controversy. Many scenes were edited or cut entirely from its original release, including the sequence where the monster drowns a little girl. In fact, that scene was thought lost for decades and was only inserted back into the movie during the 1980s. Many religious factions were offended by the concept of a man creating life, especially when Henry Frankenstein compares himself to God. To avoid offending anyone of faith, the sound of lightning was inserted during this line, making Frankenstein's claim inaudible. However, these cuts weren't good enough for Ireland, since Frankenstein was banned in the Emerald Isle almost immediately after it was distributed there. An Irish censorship member stated, "I cannot issue a general certificate licensing this film for exhibition to audiences containing children or nervous people. It is a horror, and notwithstanding its grotesque absurdity, its cruelty and brutality would have a demoralizing effect on many. I reject the film as being unfit for exhibition even to an adult audience, as it panders to the morbid and unhealthy-minded." Even though the Irish censors came down hard on Frankenstein, the decision was overturned after only 1 month. Freaks, United Kingdom. After the blinding success of Todd Browning's Dracula, it looked like the director was about to become a Hollywood powerhouse. 1 year later, the iconic filmmaker released his follow-up, Freaks, which centered around a troupe of abnormal sideshow performers. Freaks may have been the talk of the town, but it wasn't for the reasons Browning was hoping for. Although modern viewers mightn't think the movie is controversial, that's because they haven't watched the original version. In fact, nobody alive today has seen the first cut of Freaks, since 30 minutes of content was removed and destroyed shortly after its release. As a result, scenes depicting Hercules being castrated and the troupe mutilating Cleopatra have been lost forever. As far as we know, the truncated 64-minute cut is the only version that exists. This abridged edition wasn't good enough for the British censors, who believed the film's reputation had been tainted beyond repair. When a woman tried suing MGM on the grounds that watching Freaks caused her to suffer a miscarriage, it makes sense why the British censors wanted nothing to do with the film. Due to the controversy, Freaks didn't see distribution in the UK for 30 years.